I still remember the moment like it happened yesterday. I was standing by the break room coffee machine pouring a splash of oat milk into my cup when Brandon, our new CEO and son of the company's founder, walked in. No hello, no nod, not even a glance. He looked at me the same way you'd look at an outdated printer, something that had served its purpose but now just took up space. "Rachel," he said sharply, "I need to see you in my office." There was no invitation in his tone, just an order. I had been with the company for 11 years. 11. I built our client services department from the ground up. I negotiated over 100 contracts, managed crisis after crisis, and mentored most of the team now sitting outside that very office. But none of that seemed to matter to Brandon. He walked into the business like he was still playing CEO in some college case study. No respect for the work, the people, or the history. He had the title, and he thought that made him king. I followed him, keeping my face calm, though my stomach churned. When we reached his office, he didn't sit. He didn't offer me a seat either. "You're fired," he said flatly. "We don't need lazy people like you dragging this place down." At first, I thought I misheard him. I blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me?" he said, casually flipping through a stack of papers like he was browsing a takeout menu. "Pack your things. Effective immediately." And that was it. After over a decade of my life given to that place, I was out. No explanation. No thanks. Just gone. I walked out with my head held high, but inside I was shaking. Not just from the shock, but from the betrayal. I had given more to that company than I gave to my own family. Holidays, worked through most of them. Birthdays, canceled plans. I even took work calls while signing my divorce papers. All of that. And I was tossed aside like I never mattered. But I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was curious. Because something didn't add up. Brandon's timing was strange. We were just days away from finalizing the biggest deal in our company's history, a multi-million-dollar contract with Kingswell Distribution. A deal I had poured 6 months into, a deal I was the sole negotiator for. The next morning, just after 9 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a number I hadn't seen in years. David, the founder, Brandon's father, the man who had interviewed and hired me over a decade ago. "Rachel," he said, his voice strained. "What the hell happened? Why did you leave?" I told him the truth. Silence. "Did he even read your contract?" he finally asked. "What do you mean?" "You're the only one legally authorized to negotiate Kingswell. That clause was written in for a reason." I sat in stunned silence. Brandon hadn't read the contract. He fired the one person who could close the deal he needed most. And that's when the anger kicked in. But not the kind that makes you scream and shout. This was quiet anger. Cold, calculated. The kind of anger that doesn't want revenge, but resolution. David didn't waste time. By mid-morning, I was getting calls from the office. Reception, accounting, even Brandon himself, all frantic. I didn't answer. Let them sweat. By noon, I walked back into that building, not as an employee begging for a second chance, but as the woman they never should have underestimated. And the look on Brandon's face when he saw me? Priceless. Because this time, I wasn't there to prove myself like he'd already done that. I was there to finish what I started, to finalize the deal, to show everyone, especially Brandon, that true leadership isn't about titles, it's about integrity. And I wasn't going to let anyone, not even the boss's son, take that from me again. The Kingswell deal had been signed, the headlines written, and my name, though never mentioned, was finally being whispered in the halls for the right reasons. But just when I thought I could finally breathe, the atmosphere inside the office shifted again. Not all at once. No grand drama. Just tension. the kind you don't see until it settles into your bones like the chill of early October. I knew it was Brandon. He'd gone quiet after being publicly humiliated by his father. But men like Brandon don't accept defeat. They plot, they wait, and then they start playing dirtier games. At first, it was little things. My travel expense report, approved weeks ago, was suddenly missing. A presentation I submitted for an internal review came back marked incomplete, though I knew I'd uploaded every slide. Then came the email, sent from my account, filled with incorrect data, forwarded to a longtime client. That one hit hard. Thankfully, the client knew me well enough to question it. But the damage was done. Doubt had been planted. That was the play. Not fire me again. That didn't work the first time. No, this time it was about slowly, quietly making me look unstable, unreliable. The kind of person who couldn't be trusted with high-stakes deals. It was corporate sabotage, pure and simple. And I'd seen it before. I remembered my first job out of college, working for a man who never raised his voice but cut people down with spreadsheets and silence. He'd isolate them from key meetings, accidentally misfile their work, and then act concerned when upper management started to question their performance. Most people just quit, slipped away without fanfare. I almost did too, until I found another way. This time, I was ready. I didn't react emotionally. I didn't accuse anyone publicly. I did what all seasoned professionals learn to do when the ground starts shifting under their feet. I documented everything. I started a personal notebook. Not digital, paper. Because Brandon might have been able to manipulate the system, but he couldn't edit ink. I logged every delay, every discrepancy, every subtle attempt to undermine me. I kept copies of emails, took screenshots, even started printing documents with timestamps, and I played the long game. I smiled in meetings. I praised team wins. I made sure my work stayed airtight, so precise it couldn't be questioned. But behind the scenes, I was building a file so detailed it could stand up in court. Still, the weight of it all wore on me. There's something deeply exhausting about pretending everything's fine while you're quietly watching your career get chipped away by someone too arrogant to admit he made a mistake. Then, one afternoon, I overheard it. Brandon talking too loudly in a conference room, probably assuming I wasn't around. "She's unstable," he said. "Since she came back, she's been erratic, aggressive, not fit to manage high-pressure clients." I froze just outside the glass wall, heart pounding. Another voice, someone newer, I think, pushed back, mentioning the Kingswell deal. Brandon scoffed. She got lucky. It wasn't just sabotage anymore. He was actively preparing to replace me. That night, I stayed late. The office was mostly dark. The break room was empty. I sat in a glass-walled meeting space, staring out over the city skyline, and made a decision. I wouldn't just survive this. I was going to end it. When David found me there, his face worn from the weight of everything, I told him the truth. All of it. I didn't ask for protection. I didn't cry or beg. I simply laid out the facts and let him choose who he wanted to be, a CEO or a father. To his credit, he didn't hesitate. The next day, an internal audit was launched. I wasn't naive enough to think it would fix everything overnight. But for the first time since this started, I didn't feel alone. Mark, the lead auditor, was meticulous, calm. He asked questions, cross-checked logins, and he found the patterns. Sabotage traced back to shared computers and Brandon's assistant's credentials. When they called me in to review the findings, Mark didn't sugarcoat it. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "This was coordinated, deliberate, and it wasn't just you." That hit me like a brick, because I'd always assumed it was personal. About the Kingswell deal, about Brandon's bruised ego, but the deeper we looked, the clearer it became. He'd done this before. Quietly forced out talented people who didn't play along. People like me, but not me. Not anymore. When David asked me to attend the audit review meeting, I agreed. Not because I needed to be there, but because I wanted to look every single one of them in the eye and say, without words, I'm still standing. That boardroom meeting changed everything. The audit team laid out the evidence. Brandon tried to bluff, then deny. But the data was too clean, too specific. And David? He didn't hesitate this time. Suspended, effective immediately, he said. Brandon left in silence, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt breathable again. The battle wasn't over, but I had won the round that mattered, not by screaming, not by begging, but by being the one thing he never expected. Stronger. And I knew this much. I wasn't just surviving the storm anymore. I was steering through it. The moment I walked out of that boardroom, something in me clicked into place. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. I wasn't just someone who survived a corporate ambush. I was someone who stood tall in the eye of the storm and didn't flinch. But even with Brandon's suspension, I knew the danger wasn't over. Not yet. For people like him, losing power isn't the end. It's just a pause before they try to take it back. So I did what any seasoned professional would. I got to work. I didn't waste time celebrating. Instead, I met with my team the very next morning. We gathered in the glass-walled conference room, the same room where so many sleepless nights had ended in triumph. I looked around the table at faces I had trained, mentored, watched grow into leaders. People who once doubted their place in the company, but who now sat taller, shoulders squared, knowing the tide was finally shifting. I'm not here to pretend nothing happened, I began, my voice calm but resolute. We've all seen what happens when someone puts ego before ethics, but we also saw what happens when we stand for something better. This is our moment to rebuild, not just our department, but our integrity. The team responded, not with applause, but with nods and determined eyes. They were ready. We all were. Over the next few weeks, I initiated reforms that had been long overdue. We updated project tracking systems, realigned roles based on merit, not politics, and created an anonymous reporting structure, something I wished had existed when I was fighting this battle alone. Still, I couldn't ignore the tension in the air. Brandon might have been gone, but his shadow lingered. Whispers still followed me in the hallway. Some were supportive, others laced with doubt. Corporate culture doesn't change overnight, especially when the poison has had years to settle in. That's when I got the idea. One evening, sitting in my office, the temporary one they gave me while the leadership suite was under renovation, I pulled out an old folder I hadn't looked at in years. Inside were notes from a training seminar I had once pitched to HR and had been promptly dismissed. It was a leadership development program centered on ethical decision-making, conflict resolution, and employee empowerment. Back then, the company saw it as fluffy. Now, in the wake of Brandon's wake, it felt essential. I called a meeting with David and presented the proposal again, this time with added context. The rising turnover, the fear-based silence, the risk to our long-term growth. He listened intently. No interruptions, no side glances at his phone. When I finished, he leaned forward. Let's make this mandatory for all team leads, and let's put you in charge of rolling it out. It wasn't just validation. It was a vote of confidence in my leadership, and in the culture shift we both knew had to happen. Meanwhile, word of Brandon's termination had spread beyond our walls. I started receiving messages from industry colleagues, some congratulatory, others curious. How did you pull that off? Tell me how you kept your composure. Can we talk strategy over coffee? I wasn't used to this kind of spotlight. For years, I'd been the quiet one, the behind-the-scenes fixer. But now, I was the face of resilience. And oddly, that didn't scare me. It felt earned. But even as the company's morale began to improve and our partnerships grew stronger, I knew I had one last bridge to cross: myself. One afternoon, I stayed late, reviewing a contract in the same corner of the office where I used to work 10-hour days unnoticed. My reflection in the dark window stared back, older, wiser, and yes, a little tired. But there was strength in her gaze. She didn't break when she was cast aside. She didn't run when sabotage tried to sink her career. She stayed, she fought, and she rose. That reflection reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. I didn't want revenge. I wanted to build something better. That night, I wrote a personal note to David, not as an employee to a CEO, but as someone who had witnessed both the worst and the best of what leadership can be. I know what this company was built on, I wrote, not just contracts and numbers, but trust, loyalty, and grit. If we're going to move forward, let's make those values visible again. The next morning, his reply was waiting in my inbox. Agreed. Let's rebuild together. It was a simple exchange, but for me, it was everything. Proof that redemption doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes quietly, through action, accountability, and a choice to keep showing up, even when it's hard. I wasn't just back. I was leading. And I wasn't going anywhere. Even after I returned to the company with my role reinstated and authority over the Kingswell deal, something in the air felt different, colder. The kind of cold that doesn't come from a faulty thermostat, but from whispered conversations that stop when you enter a room, from side glances shared too quickly to be innocent. I knew the look well. It was the kind of look that said, "We're watching her now." And I knew exactly who had orchestrated it. Brandon. He may have been sidelined, but a man like that didn't know how to lose quietly. He didn't confront things head on. He let sabotage do the talking. Little things began to shift. First, my reimbursement for the Kingswell travel expenses was misplaced. Then, internal memos I never wrote showed up under my name. I reported each incident, but somehow it kept happening. Like clockwork. Spreadsheets were altered, deadlines were mysteriously missed. My login credentials were used after hours, and every incident pointed back to me. But I had learned. At my age, after over a decade in corporate America, you understand the value of a paper trail. I started logging everything: dates, times, names, emails. I kept a personal journal, jotted down every subtle jab, every suspicious error, every unexplained delay. It wasn't just paranoia, it was survival. And then came the moment of confirmation. I was passing by a conference room when I heard my name. "She's unstable," Brandon said, his voice arrogant and dripping with false concern. "She's been erratic ever since she came back. I don't think she's fit to lead high-pressure accounts anymore." I froze, heart pounding. He was doing it, poisoning the well. Again. The rest of the week, I worked like a machine. Not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I wanted to make it impossible for him to discredit me. I made sure every email was airtight, every deadline met early, every deliverable polished to perfection. That Friday, David called me into his office. He closed the door and handed me a manila folder. "Your updated contract," he said. "Everything you asked for: autonomy, legal protection, and a clause that prevents Brandon from interfering." I thanked him. But I could tell he wasn't done. "I've started an internal audit," he continued, lowering his voice. "Too many anomalies. Too many good people pushed out over the last year. I need to know what's really been happening under my roof." I nodded slowly. "Thank you for doing the right thing." He exhaled, visibly weighed down. I gave him too much, too fast. I wanted to believe he was ready. His eyes met mine. But if it's between protecting the company and protecting my son, I have to choose the company. The audit moved fast. Anonymous testimonies poured in. IT tracked suspicious login activity. Documents were recovered, and it all pointed back to the same office. Brandon's. I was asked to join the internal hearing, not because I was on the audit team, but because I was the target. The boardroom was packed the morning of the hearing. Mark, the lead auditor, stood beside David. I walked in wearing navy blue, sharp and composed, with my journal tucked inside my handbag. Brandon was already there, arms crossed, a smug grin plastered on his face. Until he saw me. "She's not on the committee," he said sharply. "She's here at my request," David replied, not even looking his way. Mark started the presentation. Slide after slide of evidence, false emails, altered documents, misused credentials. All roads led back to Brandon or his assistant's login. "This is a stretch," Brandon tried to interject, waving a hand dismissively. "She's just bitter. She was fired." I leaned forward. "No, Brandon, I'm just tired of being underestimated." David finally stood. His voice was calm, but firm. "Brandon, you had every opportunity to lead with integrity. Instead, you chose sabotage. You disrespected our staff, compromised a major deal, and endangered the very foundation of this company." A long silence followed. "Effective immediately," he continued, "you are suspended. The board will review this report in full." Brandon didn't speak. He stood, red-faced, and walked out of the room without a word. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled. This wasn't victory. It was vindication. Not just for me, but for every person who had watched their hard work be swept aside by entitlement. I didn't want revenge. I wanted justice. And finally, I was getting it. David looked at me and said quietly, "You didn't just save the Kingswell deal, Rachel. You saved this company's soul." I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this. I had faced the storm, documented every gust of wind, every crack of thunder, and I had come through it stronger, not smaller. I wasn't just surviving the corporate game anymore. I was rewriting the rules. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. Not just because Brandon was finally out of the picture, but because the air in that building no longer carried the weight of suspicion. The whispers had started to fade. People were beginning to look each other in the eye again. The tension that had blanketed the office like a heavy winter fog was slowly lifting, and I wasn't going to let it settle again. I sat in my new office, which was still temporary while they renovated the executive wing, and stared at the nameplate sitting blank on my desk. Director of Client Strategy. The title was nice, but it wasn't the name that mattered. It was what I was determined to do with the position. I'd earned this seat not because of politics, but because I had fought for it, clawed my way back with nothing but truth, receipts, and quiet strength. My first order of business wasn't about numbers or strategy decks. It was people. I remembered the looks of hesitation on my coworkers' faces when I walked back into that building after Brandon's suspension. I remembered the fear in the voice of the junior rep who asked me, in private, "How did you stay so calm?" And I remembered the names of the talented folks who had left without a trace over the last year, their resumes slipping quietly into the ether while Brandon poisoned the waters. It had to change. And not just for me, but for everyone who'd ever been told to sit down and be grateful. So I started with 3 simple goals: rebuild trust, restore transparency, and give people the confidence to speak without fear. The first thing I implemented was a confidential reporting system. An internal hotline that didn't run through HR or management, but straight through my office. Anonymous, secure. No retaliation allowed. I made it clear. If something unethical was happening, I wanted to know. And if you spoke up, you wouldn't be punished. You'd be protected. The second thing, I brought back 2 employees who had quietly left under Brandon's so-called realignment. One was a woman named Hannah, sharp, loyal, and wickedly good with analytics. She'd quit after being sidelined from a project she created from the ground up. The other was Mark, a systems analyst who'd flagged discrepancies in a project Brandon was funneling resources from. Both were hesitant to return, but when they did, the morale shift was immediate. The third thing? I made time. Every Thursday at 2 p.m., I blocked off an hour in my calendar and opened my office to anyone. No appointments, no filters. If you had something to say, a question, an idea, a concern, you could come in and say it. And slowly, people started coming. Some just to chat, others to share things they hadn't told anyone before. The floodgates didn't open all at once, but I saw the ripples. One day, a young man named Luke, who had only been with us for 6 months, stepped in and closed the door behind him. I wasn't sure I should come, he admitted, fidgeting with his ID badge. But I saw what you did with Brandon and how you handled it. I stayed quiet, letting him find his words. My last job? He continued. I saw some things I shouldn't have. Management looked the other way. I kept quiet. Then one day, I was gone. No explanation. I swore I'd never speak up again. He looked me in the eye. But I think maybe here I can. That's when I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the culture we had to build from the ashes. The weeks flew by. Meetings, audits, client calls, onboarding 2 new team leads. But every time I walked through the halls, I saw something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. Small, flickering, maybe, but hope nonetheless. David kept his word. Brandon's name was no longer attached to any major decisions, and quietly, new protocols were being added: checks and balances, executive training, leadership accountability. It wasn't flashy, and it wouldn't win any headlines, but it was real, and real was enough. Of course, not everyone was on board. There were murmurs in corners, resistance from a few old guard managers who still believed leadership was about fear, not service. But I didn't meet their silence with fire. I met it with performance, with consistency, with a track record they couldn't argue with. We didn't need another Brandon. We needed a new standard. It wasn't about burning bridges. It was about building ones that couldn't be manipulated or weaponized, ones that held weight, even in storms. And slowly, I started to see it. People offering ideas without fear, colleagues checking in on one another, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Productivity ticked up, but more than that, so did joy. Real joy. The kind you feel when your workplace doesn't suck the soul out of you every Monday morning. One evening, long after most folks had left, I found myself standing in the same boardroom where Brandon's downfall began. The glass still carried fingerprints from tense meetings and hushed conversations, but the energy in the room was different now. I looked out at the skyline, bathed in gold and blue, and thought to myself, this isn't just about surviving anymore. It's about redefining what it means to lead. And as I turned off the lights and closed the door behind me, I knew. We were just getting started. The first few weeks in my new role as Director of Client Strategy felt like stepping into a house I used to clean, only now I held the keys. The desk was mine. The decisions were mine. But with it came a different kind of weight. The weight of rebuilding not just a team, but trust. Trust in leadership. Trust in the system. Trust that the whispers, the fear, the silent walking on eggshells culture would finally be replaced with something stronger. I didn't walk in swinging a hammer. That wasn't my style. You don't fix years of damage overnight with a motivational poster and a company-wide email. Instead, I listened. Every day, I carved out 1 hour, sometimes over coffee, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes in a quiet corner of the building, to talk to people, not about sales quotas or market trends, but about how they felt, what they'd seen, what they were afraid to say out loud before. It was like opening a floodgate, stories of being passed over for promotions, of subtle retaliation, of HR reports that went mysteriously missing, of ideas stolen in meetings, of voices talked over, of talent drowned out by egos. None of it surprised me. I'd lived it. But hearing it from people I respected, from those who had quietly stayed and those who had nearly walked, hardened my resolve. So I started laying the foundation. The first change? Transparency. I implemented a bi-weekly strategy forum. It wasn't mandatory, and it wasn't a PowerPoint parade. It was a space for open conversation. Wins and failures, updates and honest feedback, even criticism, were not just allowed, but welcomed. And when I spoke, I made sure my words matched my actions. Second, accountability, no more favoritism. No more side door promotions or unspoken hierarchies. I worked with HR to introduce a peer review component into evaluations, not to spy or pit colleagues against one another, but to bring balance. You couldn't climb over people anymore. You had to rise with them. And third, the one I knew would ruffle feathers, I opened a confidential reporting channel run by an outside consultant, completely independent. If someone retaliated for speaking up, it would come to me directly. No more swept under the rug behavior. Some execs pushed back. I could see it in their eyes. That wary glance that said, "You're rocking the boat." I didn't care. This wasn't about appeasing the old guard. This was about building a place people wanted to work in, not just a place they tolerated because it paid well and had good coffee in the break room. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday in March. We were hosting a quarterly town hall, and I invited every department head to submit one employee to share a story of resilience or innovation. Not KPI charts, not spreadsheets, stories. A young analyst from the logistics team, barely 2 years in, stood up and spoke about how her team had cut delivery delays by 35% during the holiday rush without additional budget. She choked up halfway through, not because she was nervous, but because, she said, "It's the first time I've ever felt seen." The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was thunderous. And in that moment, I knew we were finally turning the ship. A few days later, I got a message from David. Just 6 words. Now, this is leadership. I saved it because while the office had been filled with change, new policies, new energy, even new hires, that message reminded me what this was really about. It wasn't just about correcting Brandon's damage. It wasn't about getting even. It was about building a legacy that didn't require someone to burn out just to be valued. That month, our internal engagement score jumped 14%. Clients noticed too. I started getting emails that didn't just compliment our efficiency, but our empathy, something rare in our line of work. And yet, even as progress took root, I remained watchful. Because people like Brandon, they don't just vanish, they linger, they regroup. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had faced the worst kind of betrayal. Not the kind that screams in your face, but the kind that smiles while it steals your credibility. And I didn't just survive it. I built something better in its place. And as I locked up my office late one evening, walking past glass-walled conference rooms now filled with actual collaboration, not corporate politics, I realized something. Power isn't given, it's proven, not with titles or corner offices, but with courage, with clarity, with consistency. And I had all three. The first Monday in my new role felt different. I arrived before 8 a.m., coffee in hand, heels echoing across the polished floors. But this time, I wasn't heading to a cubicle. I walked straight to my new office. Temporary, yes, but mine all the same. My nameplate hadn't been installed yet, and the walls were bare. Still, it felt like a beginning. Not just for me, but for the company. There's something surreal about walking back into a place that once pushed you out, this time through the front doors, not quietly through the side exit. I wasn't just returning with a new title, I was returning with a mission. David had kept his word. The promotion to director of client strategy came with full autonomy. But more than that, he'd handed me something far more valuable, his trust. And I didn't plan on wasting it. The first thing I did was meet with my old team. Some had reached out privately during the fallout. Others had stayed silent. I didn't blame them. Everyone had been walking on eggshells since Brandon's arrival. But now the eggshells were swept away. It was time to talk, honestly. We gathered in a small conference room, just 10 of us, seated around a worn oak table I'd fought to keep when corporate wanted to modernize. I glanced around at the familiar faces. "I'm not here to pretend the past year didn't happen," I said, folding my hands. "And I'm not interested in revenge. I'm here because I believe we deserve better." No one spoke at first. Then one of the junior analysts, a bright young woman named Emily, raised her hand slightly. "What if Brandon comes back?" she asked. I didn't flinch. "He won't," I said firmly. "But even if someone like him ever does, we'll be ready. We're changing how this place works, starting now." I could feel it in the room, that slow, cautious hope. It was fragile, but real, and I knew it had to be nurtured. Over the next few weeks, I made time for every employee who wanted to talk, no matter their department or title. I reopened communication lines that had been quietly shut. I sat in on entry-level team huddles and senior strategy meetings alike. I created an anonymous feedback system and implemented a no-interruption rule in meetings. A subtle but effective way to make sure everyone had a voice, not just the loudest or highest paid ones. And I reinstated 3 employees who had left under Brandon's shadow. One of them, a marketing manager named Jason, shook my hand and whispered, "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did," I replied. "We lost good people. That ends now." Culture isn't something you print on posters or recite in boardrooms. It's what happens in the hallways, in the way people speak when no one's listening. It's trust, earned one moment at a time. And trust had been broken here. So I worked late. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to set the tone. I left handwritten thank you notes on desks, celebrated small wins with bakery cupcakes, and even brought back the old Friday 5 routine. 5 minutes for anyone to share ideas, stories, or frustrations at the week's end. It was small, but it mattered. One afternoon, as I was walking to the lobby, I spotted David by the elevators. He looked tired. He always did now, but when he saw me, his eyes softened. "You're doing good work," he said. "I'm trying," I replied. He nodded, then hesitated. "Brandon, he's not taking it well." I paused, then said, "I'm not surprised." He exhaled slowly. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry, for all of it." "Thank you," I said simply. There wasn't much else to say. Some wounds don't need to be reopened, just acknowledged. That night, I stayed a little later than usual. I sat alone in my office, the city glowing beyond the windows. I looked at the photos I'd pinned to the wall, my team at the Kingswell signing, the client thank you card, and one old snapshot of me at my very first employee orientation. So much had changed, but one thing never would. I knew my worth now. And I'd make sure no one in this building ever had to forget theirs again. This story delivers a powerful message about resilience, self-worth, and the importance of integrity in leadership, especially relevant for middle-aged Americans navigating careers, transitions, or workplace injustice. For many professionals who have dedicated decades of loyalty and hard work to an organization, being blindsided by leadership, particularly younger or less experienced ones, handed power without wisdom, can feel like betrayal. But Rachel's journey offers a different kind of resolution. She doesn't explode or seek revenge. Instead, she shows us the value of strategic composure. Her calm determination to rise above pettiness, to document injustice carefully, and to protect her professional reputation sends a clear message. Dignity and discipline can be more powerful than retaliation. When faced with sabotage and being unfairly dismissed, she chose not to crumble, but to rise, rebuild, and lead by example. For anyone who has felt overlooked, underestimated, or even wronged at work, especially in midlife, Rachel's story is a reminder that your value is not erased by one person's poor judgment. It's earned through years of grit, wisdom, and integrity. And it's never too late to reclaim your voice or reshape the environment you once felt powerless in. Whether you're restarting, leading, or healing from corporate wounds, let this be a call to stand tall, keep records, build allies, and never forget. Leadership isn't about titles, it's about how you treat people when no one's watching. Just like Rachel, you might be the quiet force that brings real change.